Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. Hopefully, as stage one wraps up, we might get a few more people join. But we've already got 45 and we haven't started yet, so I think that's a good start. My name's James Maddison. I'm a senior consultant at the ODI. I'm joined by my colleague Dave.
Hi, thanks, James. Yes, I'm the Senior Learning Advisor, but also the lead of the Data Literacy Program at the ODI. So it's been fantastic to hear all the conversations around literacy today. And perhaps in this session, we'll also be offering a little bit on some of the tooling that we've also been talking a bit about today. So, James, shall I kick off?
Yes, please.
A few things that we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be talking about the online data ethics canvas, or the interactive data ethics canvas, as we also call it. Some of you might have already found out about this through the fact that it's in our showcase. So if you want to find out a little bit about it, and also a little video preview, then go to the showcase as well. But in this session, we're going to go through a little bit of some of the background of it. How did we get here? What are some of the data ethics tools that we've been working with over the last year? Last years, I should say. I'm going to be looking at the evolving landscape and some of the kind of the reviews we've been doing around data ethics that's led to the new version of the data ethics canvas this year that is available to you all publicly, and also the interactive data ethics canvas that James is going to attempt to give a live demo of. So I'll leave him to do that. And then also he's going to talk around, how and when to use these tools. And that's really the critical part, because it's about when do you start applying it? And with data ethics, as you will gather, as with any ethical tool, actually, it's not about being a box ticking exercise at the beginning of some kind of project where you fill in a piece of paperwork and file it in a drawer. It's a much more continuous process. And so James will talk about a little bit about that, and also point you towards a recent post that we've put live on the ODI site. Hopefully I'm not dipping anything into it. It is live, isn't it, James?
It's purposely been left not live so it doesn't get lost in all of the other summit documentation that goes up on the website, but it will go up this week.
There will be a post up this week that kind of refers back to this session, and also some of the concepts that we're introducing into it. Thank you, James. Sorry, I wasn't quite aware of that. Anyway, let's have a look at some of the background. And also, as James mentioned, for those of you in the chat, we will be doing a little bit of Q&A at the end. We've got around about 40 minutes for the session. So if people do have questions, we can take some Q&A at the end. So background to data ethics. Well, I guess at the ODI, we started a decade ago now. Can't believe we've been doing that many summits. We started with a focus on open data, and that absolutely is still a key part of what we do. And Tim Berners-Lee's still been talking about that today, about the fact that we have to ensure that there is maintains an open standards, open web, open open data. The word open is absolutely key. Okay, and because if things aren't open, you begin to suspect what the sort of questions. Why aren't things open? Why aren't people being transparent? Again, Nigel's been talking about algorithmic transparency today in the context of data protection. So there's a lot here in terms of evolving from open into a different word, and that word is trust. And that's something that with data has been questioned over the last few years. I mean, take one big scandal, for example, which would be the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, particularly the UK and the US, in terms of where data is being accessed and used for what a lot of people see as an unethical purpose. Okay, so we're not talking, there are obviously legal aspects to this, but there's also a key bit about ethics. Is it acceptable to use data in that way, even if it's legal to have access to it? And so this really blew up as something that people kind of looked at and thought was really some unethical practices going on in here. And again, it's around some of the personal data. There's other aspects as well with kind of not just personal data, but other types of data. And so over the last few years, we've also obviously been all within the COVID pandemic, right? That's been a big thing. That's been kind of a big talking point in our lives over the last year. And again, we've got lots and lots of ethical conversations are going on around, how COVID-19 has really challenged people to think about how data, not just about you, but data in general, is being accessed, used, and shared. Who should have access to the vulnerable patient list in order to help them. There's been lots of conversations where there's been a lot of effort to have that data sharing practice in place to ensure that the right people have access to the data to provide the ethical services to people who really need them. And as technology moves forward as well, we've got a lot of other practices which are currently seen as highly ethically questionable. Things around cameras. We're surrounded by them today at Summit HQ. They're everywhere. But cameras that are in the streets and monitoring us now to the extent of being able to recognize a face. And it's become more than just a question of CCTV. It's traditionally stored on a, showing my age now, video cassette tape, that's wiped every 24 hours. There's now that element of that data point about you is transferred and stored and referenced and reused in many different contexts, potentially a lot of them that you're unaware of, or potentially, again, unethical. And so at the ODI, trust has always been a core part of our mission, particularly over the last few years. The summit has been trust has been a really key part of the discussion at the summit. And as people may know or have been around for a while, we've been doing a lot in the area of ethics at the ODI because we developed a definition of data ethics. And the key to our definition is a lot of the ethical frameworks and codes and guidelines out there in the wild focus on the ethical use of data. At the ODI, we decided to focus wider than that, because if you think about facial recognition, a lot of the reaction to it at the moment has been around the unknown use of data, right? So people don't know what's happening with it. But at the same time, then, well, what's the reason for its collection? Because we don't know what's happening with it. What's the reason for its collection? Again, this is a principle that's come, made its way into law through things like GDPR. So we've got data minimization as a principle. So at the ODI, we see data ethics as a practice, right? Looking at the adverse impacts on people and society in the collection, sharing, and use of data. And I always like to consider within that, by the way, the not collecting, the not sharing, and the not using data as something we should also consider. So you should always put in front of these three words the not as well, because we have two ways of looking at our theory of change. Actually, if we just go back a slide, James, at the ODI, you'll notice at the top, sorry to challenge you to do that, at the top of this, we have these two dystopias to what we see as data having positive impact, when it's stewarded well, when it's, maybe it's part of data trust. We've heard about those talking about today. When people are creating and deciding who gets access to it, that's what leads to the positive impact. But we've got two dystopias here. One is a data hoarding dystopia. And this is on the right-hand side. This is what happens when data is not shared, right? Okay, so this is when people want to keep hold. Tim Berners-Lee calls them data huggers. I love that expression. It's my data. I'm going to keep hold of the data that we have. And so when data isn't shared, right, we see the kind of the data hoarding, and that isn't just about the big top companies who, in terms of intangible value, another thing that Nigel's been talking about today. Who are hoarding data. There's often aspects, and we saw this during COVID, where people were reluctant to share data about vulnerable people with those who need it, okay, because of the fears over data protection breaches and things like that. So it becomes unethical at that point. It's not unlawful. It becomes unethical to hold on to the data, to hoard the data, and to not share it with those who need it. And again, we can talk about the climate crisis. That's a sort of topic that's hot on everyone's subject of conversation right now. Are we actually able to access data that we need to make informed decisions about how to move forward with climate, build good models around the weather, etc.? Are we sharing data effectively to help us solve health issues? We heard in the keynote this morning as well around that. How do we, what's going to be the new emergence to stop this, prevent this data hoarding? How do we combat it as a thing to make sure that the data is getting to those who need it? And that's a key part of it. So it can be unethical to not share it, which is key. On the other side of that, there's the data fearing aspect, which is they're not then doing anything with it. We've got a perfectly usable piece of data, but we fear what might happen with it. So you can kind of over fear, and that can often lead to them not collecting, not sharing, and not using. So it is worth bearing in mind with the definition that when you're looking at ethical practices, it's not the ethics of collecting, using, and sharing it, but also the ethics of not collecting, not using, and not sharing it. So that's really where we've been focused at the ODI, and one of the things that we've got is a couple of tools that can help people with this. Over the past year, people may have heard we've also become the current steward of the .everyone toolkit. So one of the tools that we have that everyone can get access to is the consequence scanning toolkit. So consequence scanning is really a process that you should carry out at the beginning of any project. And James will talk about this in a little bit more detail later on in the session, to have a look at what might be the potential consequences of what I've just been talking about not doing something or doing something, okay? And what might be some of the unforeseen uses, how might doing this erode trust, right? Regardless of the use, just the collection of data might erode trust, or not collecting or not sharing it might erode trust. And again, a big key topic we've been talking about today. Impact on the environment. Should we be, a lot of people are now beginning to ask, we want to collect, people talk about collecting a lot of data all the time, but are we duplicating that data? If everyone has got a copy of masses and masses of data lakes and it's all the same data, what kind of environmental impact does that have? Should we make an ecosystem where there is more sharing going on, so there's more, efficiencies in the way that we are collecting data and sharing data? So what kind of impact does that have on the environment, when we have all this computing power everywhere, when actually we could share it a lot more? And then we've got things like, the changes in norms and behaviors that it might happen that might be the unforeseen ones. So does doing something actually result in the inverse behavior to the one that you're after? How does that affect people within society? And these are not necessarily all challenges that a technical team can deal with, when developing any project. So you need a broad brush of people involved in the process of thinking about potential consequences. And so the toolkit tends to take you through the guide on who you need in the room, or what the kind of process, what the kind of questioning that you need to ask in order to establish what kind of consequences, both positive and negative, especially some of the negative, to iterate over them. At the ODI, we've been doing stuff with our data ethics canvas for a number of years. And for those of you who have been with us through this journey, thank you. Potentially you've used a number of different versions. We started off with a rather pink version, thinking about some of the questions that you would ask at different stages during a project. And what we started doing here was to really jot down some of those questions and to give people kind of like space to think. That was the idea of the canvas. It's not really the guidelines, it's really giving people space to think. We produced a second iteration of this as we added, I think it was one additional question, led us to a nice grid within this. And this is where we started to really evolve the idea of delving into each kind of area. That led us to a much more colorful version as well that goes on top of that. Similarly, again, diving into what is a number of key areas in collecting, around collecting data, around using data, around sharing data. And then there are some other key topics within that. And so we got to this version where we've got lots and lots of questions. And honestly, what we wanted to find out is, well, has any of this been useful, right? What do people think of it? How is the ethics, how is the data ethics landscape evolving? What do people think of the tools? What's the next steps? And so what we did is we actually commissioned a study done by Consequential to look at the next generation of data ethics tools. And this was a short project carried out in May of 2021. Okay, so just going through, I thought it'd be useful just to go through this to give you some kind of background, be transparent around some of the background and the feedback that we got. So in terms of the project itself, I won't go through everything on here. There was a hell of a lot of qualitative feedback. So we spoke to a lot of people, or rather we engaged with a lot of people through this research. We also did lots of kind of thematic analysis on where the consistencies were. We defined we defined how we wanted to bring out the insights, because people had a lot of different kind of viewpoints on this, and what we wanted to do is boil it down into, well, what are the key things that we can do in order to support the area going forward. Okay, as it says here, they were loosely structured, therefore we had to do quite a lot of thematic analysis around that. In terms of the interviews and who we interviewed, we were seeking different representations from different fields. So across ethics field, those already work in the area, okay, get some kind of the expert opinions on where we're going with the tools. Practitioners, those making data systems, okay, those are actually trying to apply this, is really key. And those who make a decision as a result of, right, the application of the tool. So this is really key, because what does it mean to communicate? What do you take from doing something like a data ethics canvas? And so we had some challenges, right, in creating drivers in the market. So one of the things that you probably all are thinking on this call, well, it's still a growing market. The market's limited, you know, at this point, you know, even at this point in time, perhaps there's a growing momentum behind it, but there's still a lot of early adopters, right, as we've seen out there. And a lot of those early adopters are working, as you might have seen from certain companies, you know, not necessarily the highest level of those companies. And in fact, I was on a panel recently when, you know, if you're going to be an ethicist within a company, and companies are trying to show their responsible practices by, you know, employing someone whose job it is to focus on this kind of thing. But in order to be in that job, you've got to be quite brave, because you've got to challenge. You've got to be brave enough to challenge potentially what's going on, what you see as what might be an unethical practice. But not everyone has the power and agency to address it, and so that's where some of that bravery comes in. And having the right sponsors within a company are going to really start to lead to change that environment. But it's something that's certainly going to evolve. We want to maintain hope. I love this point, right? You know, create incentives for business and professionals to participate, and we want to maintain hope that, you know, businesses do want to engage with this. And a part of this, and James will talk through later, we've been running data ethics professionals courses, and we're really pleased to see how popular they are with businesses. We've got quite a high demand at the moment to run, you know, internal versions of these courses. And we hope to be able to talk wider about that in the coming months, and what kind of things they might have led to. And we've got other things around how do we create the professional standards in this area. That's something that's still evolving, and within, James, I know you've been working on with this within the data assurance program as well. How do we actually start to create the standards and the performance incentives to start benchmarking organizations and to start having frameworks that allow them to evolve in this area, to really operationalize data ethics? So that's a slightly different thing to what we're talking about today, but it's kind of the next stage on what we need to do. One thing that the interviews found quite strongly, though, was because we are in a stage where we've got early adopters, right? We're in a bit of a chasm, as it were. Okay, there's this Geoffrey Moore graph, which we love, in terms of, you know, you get early adopters who are looking at the technological enthusiasts, you know, your visionaries. And then we need to get into the pragmatists. What does it actually mean to do this, embed it on a day-to-day basis? And that's where we've been focusing a lot of our effort at the ODI in streamlining the tools. How do we make them more accessible to more people and more understandable by more people? And also think about the operationalizing. When should you think about this? What are kind of the inception, the points within a project, right? When you should actually apply the tools? What kind of questions should you ask? What kind of, how does it fit within a day-to-day business as usual workflow? So we're kind of in that. It's an interesting place to be, and certainly a lot of research still going on in order to find out how we actually operationalize this area. So challenges in the tools. There are quite a few. One of the things that we do get asked is that, you know, there are actually quite a few tools out there. We're not going to go through, I'm not going to go into all of them. I'm sure you might have come across, you know, European data ethics frameworks. There's others from other people. You know, at the ODI, we're passionate about how can we build an open, trustworthy data ecosystem. So building tools to sort of help that, to feed, to, you know, so that, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom. right? Let's see what these tools will think about and come up with, and then perhaps the standard will emerge. As long as everyone's being open, as Tim quite rightly says, as long as everyone's being open with their tools and their thinking and their processes, then we might emerge to some shared learning, which sets a direction forward based upon loads of people doing research as opposed to just individual organizations. But so there's lots out there. I'm aware that it can be confusing for some people, but I think that's a good thing to show that there's a variety of approaches that people can take. And we know that organizations are looking for that best practice, which is why we've been trying to help them with our own tools. Specifically, as it says here, focusing on users and their needs will stand out. This is something that stood out very clearly from the research. And trying to actually dig into some of the detail rather than just looking at the high level and principle based stuff around data ethics. And again, we've been trying to do that with some of our courses and workshops and actually helping people kind of dig into some of the more detail as opposed to just looking at the high level. So tips for tech and data ethics tool design. All right, these are some of the feedback that we actually then got from the survey. The connection to organizational culture and core business drivers, something that has a methodology that people can adopt, something that we're still working on, I would say, actively. Accessibility. This is something that we really tried to focus on, how, boiling down the language or the accessibility of the canvas. You see in the new version in a little bit how we actually have rearranged it, okay, into 4 accessible groups so that people can latch on to which parts of the canvas they need to focus on specifically at an instance in time and in different parts throughout a project. So we split the canvas up a little bit. It's important that they can be consistently applied. So again, looking at the process was key. And I don't think there's much else on here I want to mention particularly. We can talk about it if we need to. But very much about, where does the process sit? How do people embed this was absolutely key. Other recommendations, case studies. Okay, this is one that we've been actively working on through our courses at the moment, how and when the tool has been used, how it can be applied to different domains where it might not have been used, but what would be the benefit if it was used. These are all things that we've been working on through some of our training as well. Explaining around personas, so who needs to be involved at specific stages in project, outlining what good looks like it's also a key thing. So it's not always about using a data ethics tool to critique something that's gone wrong. It might be actually that what we need to do is to outline the processes that led to the beneficial outcomes while avoiding the harmful impacts. I think there needs to be more positive stories out there of data ethics. I think that's a really key thing that we need to look at. Who's doing this really well? Who can we hold up and celebrate and go, this has been done really well? We need more of those because it's too easy to focus on the bad case studies. I mean, sometimes they stick in your mind, but for actual people doing it practically, they want to know, well, what can I do better? Who's done this better, etc. So there's some really key ones of that need to be collected as well. Helping people feel they can make a difference. I think that there's a key momentum behind that now, and I think that organisations are beginning to really take on board that trust is a really important aspect in a modern day business, and also the integration of the tool. So I've provided a little bit of background on that. One of the key bits of feedback that wasn't in there was that people found the canvas a bit overwhelming in terms of all the colors and the bubbles everywhere. So I'll let James talk through a little bit of that as he goes through a little bit about what we've been doing in this area in the last year, and how we've come up with a slightly modified version of the canvas that we've also put online. So James, over to you.
Great, thank you, Dave, for a great introduction to what we've been doing over what is probably about four years now, I think, around data ethics. What are we doing at the ODI about all of this stuff? We've sort of split this into 3 areas that we think kind of focus on different audiences. The first one is really around growing people's understanding and kind of base level, bringing everyone up to that base level of understanding around what we mean by data ethics. So we have a course called the Introduction to Data Ethics Training, which also involves becoming familiar with the data ethics canvas. And that's something that we recommend that anyone who is interested in data ethics but doesn't really understand how it kind of applies to the work that they do, or or what their organization focuses on, we'd really recommend checking out that course. As we've already spoken about, or Dave has it at length, we also have tools for self-application. So the Data Ethics Canvas being the main tool there, but there are also toolkits which provide context around how data ethics might sit within, for example, developing a service, which we have in our data and public services business case toolkit. Under build, this is really things for professionals, people who already understand data ethics but want to know how they can start applying that in their organization or in the work that they do. The main thing that we have is our data ethics professionals and data ethics facilitators program. This is open to anyone who works with data or has an interest in it. And it helps you to learn knowledge, skills, and how to apply tools to help others make better use of data while still thinking about minimizing those harmful impacts. And at the end of the course, you get certified. So you'll be able to say to people that you are a data ethics professional or a data ethics facilitator as certified by the ODI. We do have places open on our data ethics professional course at the moment. And Dave has told me that he recommends that you go and check that out now, or rather after this session, if you're interested in becoming a data ethics professional, because the courses this year have a slightly cheaper price than they will do next year because it's been so popular, and we're looking to grow and expand that area of the ODI's offering. And lastly, things for organizations. How do you affect change for your organization and the wider ecosystem that you operate in? One of the things that we're starting to do more of is run bespoke workshops around the data ethics canvas with organizations to help you think through a different particular ethical problem that you might have and how you unpick that. So if you're interested in kind of specific workshops, all of the links to that stuff is in the interactive data ethics canvas showcase booth that Dave mentioned earlier. And we're also doing some really interesting work around how you adopt data ethics and ethical data practices at scale within your organization, which focuses on developing a sort of data ethics maturity model, which builds on a lot of the work that Dave's already talked about to highlight how organizations kind of perform in different areas and where they might want to focus on improving. And one of the really interesting things around that is there was a session earlier in Summit looking at how organizations embed data ethics into their DNA. And one of the really strong questions that came out was around KPIs. And I think that piece of work might go some way to starting the conversation around what data ethics KPIs could look like, or how organizations can use the learnings from that model to start thinking about what KPIs might look like within their context. So one of the things that I've been working on with Dave and with our other colleagues is refining the current version of the data ethics canvas. As Dave mentioned, we've tried to make it more accessible. We've tried to consolidate the different areas that the canvas covers to make sure that people aren't kind of thinking all over the place and trying to think about too many different aspects of a project or service. So it's really clear and concise as to what different things you want to be thinking about in the canvas. We want to make sure that it's really clear what part of a data project it's for. So I'll talk through the kind of how and when in a bit. We want to provide more specific information about who should do it and when. As Dave talked about earlier, there are lots of people interested in data ethics, and so that can be quite a broad one, but I'll touch on that more in the how and when section as well. And lastly, we wanted to design a repeatable process to sit alongside the canvas, which we've started to do with the interactive version of the canvas, which I'll show you in a bit. This is our current version of the canvas. We adopted the version that we were using in our data literacy program for different various learning offerings or learning experiences, as we call them, which covers education and training. It's more user-friendly, and it has 4 specific categories, which are helpfully color-coded, but also are tagged as different areas so that people who may have difficulty with different colors can identify what sits within each section. We call the different areas Know Your Data, which is the pink section, Explore Your Impact, which is the yellow section, Plan Your Engagement, which is the green section, and lastly, Integrate Processes, which is the blue section. And this is the standard version that we now use across our website. I'm going to very briefly unshare my screen so I can show you the interactive version of the data ethics canvas. Let's pretend this is a really smooth transition, and that we didn't need to do this. So hopefully everyone can see that. This is the interactive version of the canvas. I think the main things that I want to talk you through are more around functionality rather than how you might fill it with content, because I think that that's really kind of context specific. But to further enhance the usability of the canvas, we made this interactive version. What it does is allow you to add detailed information to each section. It also provides you with additional guidance and links that might help you along the way in each various section, and it gives you an opportunity to track actions and decisions as well. So for example, if I decide that under data sources I might need to go and speak to a particular colleague, I can track that in the action section. So let's put that in, speak to Dave, and we'll make it a high priority. All of the actions and decisions that come out of this end up being transferred into the Your Action section. So as you can see, where I've put Speak to Dave in, it now gives me that action in the Your Action section. And you can use this area to kind of prioritize what it is that you need to take forwards in terms of actions and decisions. All of the information that's captured in the interactive canvas is stored locally on your computer in your browser cache. So the ODI doesn't hold that information and it won't go anywhere. You can export a version of the canvas as a JSON file when you're done, and then just load it back up later if you want to review a particular version or iteration of the canvas and then update it. I'm not going to spend too much time talking you through it because I'm aware that we are sort of pressed for time a little bit now. And we'll go back to the slides if I can ever get off of the data ethics canvas. So smooth transition back. Here we go. So how and when should you be using the tools? There are a few things that you need to think about, but firstly, I want to touch on a quote from our colleague Olivier, who is our head of research and development. It's ethics is like the company dishwasher. Technically, it's everyone's responsibility to empty it, and we all benefit from when it's done. But it's the person who cares the most who will end up doing it. Now, I'm sure we have a few people on this call who are that person who empties the metaphorical dishwasher. And you and others are likely to be the ones driving forwards the ethics agenda in your organization. But it's important to remember that it's a collective responsibility. Please make sure that you try and involve a wide range of people from your organization in, if you're doing a data ethics canvas session, or if you're talking about data ethics in a project or kind of practices context, to make sure you get a range of perspectives. In the dishwasher analogy, restacking and emptying is a regular process. So you should be thinking about reviewing and iterating on your approach as well. And we're going to talk about those things in more detail. So this very colorful, very pink and blue diagram is a working version of how we see use of the data ethics canvas through a project. Hopefully you're familiar with the double diamond model, but this is something that's quite common in project or service design, where you think about what problem you're trying to solve and explore different ways of doing that, then narrow down how you solve that problem through a focus on user needs. And then you start to develop out different prototypes or versions of solutions that might address the problem. And then finally, you settle on a final product that you want to develop further and then possibly launch. So at different stages of the double diamond, you'll want to be thinking about using both the consequence scanning toolkit and the data ethics canvas. During the discover section, any project which has a focus on access, use, or sharing data will benefit from using the impact section of the canvas, thinking about why will data actually help you solve a problem? Is data the right thing to do? And is it actually ethical to do this project in the first place? That's a consideration whether it's a data-enabled project or not. It might be also useful to use the consequence scanning toolkit at this stage to help you think about, as Dave said, some of those unintended consequences, and particularly if you don't do this project, what might the unintended consequences be? During the define section, you'll really start to want to think about what kind of data is involved in the project and how that data can help you address the problem. Is the data usable? in the situation or the scenario for the project. And then during the development stage, you want to be thinking more about, okay, well, how is what we're going to do affecting people, and have we spoken to them? Are we being transparent about the different processes and approaches that are involved in this project around data? You may also want to review the consequence scanning around this stage, just to make sure that things haven't changed from the start to this kind of midpoint within the project. And then lastly, as you start to narrow down and define what your final output looks like, or rather deliver that final output, you want to look back at what you've documented throughout the time during the project on the data ethics canvas, and make sure that anything that you've learned or anything that's changed is reflected back in that, and then you've adopted or adapted your approach to align with what you've learned. And similarly, as in the middle of the project, you'll also want to think about how different consequences might have changed or adapted depending on how the context of the project changes. Who should be involved in ethics considerations? I really like this. This was something that Dave posed. Rather than asking who should be involved, why don't we ask who shouldn't be involved? From the 4 sections of the canvas, you clearly want people who are knowledgeable in the 4 areas. So people who are data experts, people who are process leaders, those who have more of a communications expertise, and then also people who are part of the community who may be affected by the work that you plan to do. But this shouldn't be a limited list. There are a whole group of stakeholders who you might want to think about involving. I think one of the ones that comes up in particular, and something that has been referenced in one of the questions, is around kind of legal and compliance experts. And it's so important to bring those into the conversation really early on, because otherwise, I'm sure, as some of you are aware, you can end up hitting hurdles where there's a sort of disjointedness between the conversations around data ethics and the conversations around kind of legal and compliance. So really important to bring in as many people who will have a perspective as possible early on. This is a typical agenda that we have for when we run a data ethics canvas workshop, and hopefully this will give you some ideas about a structure that you might want to take if you use the data ethics canvas for thinking about project considerations. Firstly, we always start with a use case, because it's really difficult to actually have a conversation around something if you don't have a clear use case in mind. Then we start with an introduction to consequence scanning and making sure that people understand that there can be consequences that come as a result of using data and sharing data and accessing data, but similarly, as Dave said, also not using, accessing and sharing data. And then we start to think about what those consequences might be related to the use case and share that information back to the group. And then we'll go into a session using the data ethics canvas to think about, okay, within this project, how do we unpick those different challenges or unintended consequences? How do they apply to our project? And what do we need to be thinking about in terms of impact, data, engagement, and reviewing our approach? So finally, just for the best outcomes with any data ethics focused project, you need to make sure that the participants in the room are representative of the project or topic. The participants need to have a strong knowledge of the use case, or at least time to build it before the session starts. Having a completed canvas is good, but understanding the why we do this and the how we do this is more important than having a document that you can say, I've ticked the box, I've done the data ethics exercise. And lastly, data ethics is an ongoing process. It needs to be something that you think about at the start of a project, during the project, at the end of the project, and possibly even further as things begin to be kind of built off the back of that project. So these are all good things to bear in mind as you're working on projects and services and thinking about how data ethics applies in those situations. I think we'll move on to questions now. We haven't got a huge amount of time because I think we were talking for a good 35 minutes there, if not more.
That's mostly my fault. I do apologize.
No, it's fine. We have 4 questions in the chat. The first question, we'll start with the one at the bottom because that came in first. Where do you think data ethics should sit, with the CDO or DPO? Now, I have an opinion on this, Dave, but if you also have an opinion,
go for it, James. Go for it.
So personally, I think it sits with the CDO primarily if you need someone to sponsor or own data ethics, because I think that it's a wider conversation than just data protection or compliance and legal. Something that we're thinking about in the data ethics maturity model that I spoke to you about is what are the different areas of business that data ethics practices affect, or rather data practices affect, and how does introducing the concept of ethics into those data practices affect those different areas of the business. And it's really much wider than just compliance and legal. So my answer to that would be CDO, or someone who's responsible for data and what we do with data within our organizations.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think it's always worth thinking of the question that if data protection officers are focused a lot on the personal data, unethical consequences or unintended consequences don't just result from the collection and use of personal data, right? There are lots of unethical consequences that can come from the use of geographic location data, climate data, these kinds of things. They can be unethical consequences on people, but not necessarily be involving personal data. So it should absolutely sit with the CDO, but that's not saying the DPO shouldn't be involved, absolutely, because its impacts on people.
Yeah, definitely. Second question, is it possible to deactivate the zooming animation in the data ethics canvas tool? This can cause disorientation and nausea for some users. It's definitely something that we can look into. We have just finished a round of kind of iterating on the first version of the interactive canvas, and we're at the point now where we're looking to launch the new tool. But it's something that we can think about moving forwards as we move into kind of making sure we plan in iteration points for the canvas moving forwards.
I've actually added it to the next review to review that
Great.
as well. So I've already, whoever asked that question, thank you. I've already actioned it and added it to our to be reviewed. We're also aware of some of the color contrasting on the online version comes out slightly differently from the downloadable version on people's screens because of the color matching. So we just to let people know, there is a downloadable version of the new canvas. So across the website, you can download it. The interactive version, we're currently trialing with members and partners, and it is available to them. So if you want more information on that, have a look in the showcase as well. So hopefully that answers the other question there. A few questions rolling in quickly now. How do you get good at anticipating potential consequences for uses of data without imaginative skill and contextual knowledge? Any processes like this will be limited. But it's amazing how much time people think about those consequences, but don't necessarily consider them to be realistic or something that will happen. It's still a matter of documenting what you think could be an unintended consequence, or at least within a lot of the guidelines. It also says document that you've at least thought about it. Right. Yeah. I mean, I would say coming up with none is probably a rarity. There's bound to be some, even a legal person will say there are risks, right? We have a risk register for a reason, right? So there will always be some at least. And I would worry about any project that says none. James?
I think that's where this idea of who doesn't need to be involved is really useful to start thinking about. Like, if you have it in your head that you may not be able to think about the potential consequences in some of those different areas that are outlined in the consequence scanning tool, then someone in your legal and compliance team, or someone who works in a similar role but maybe in a different department, or someone who is more focused on communications, maybe are able to think in a different way to you around consequences. And that's where the power is in kind of bringing people together and having those conversations.
Yeah. I would also say on that one as well, at the ODI, bring in some of the really imaginative thinkers, artists. Right, at the ODI we have the Data as Culture program. If you haven't engaged with it through the summit today, I would highly encourage you to, because they are really creative thinkers about thinking about what might be some of the unintended consequences of interacting with data or using data, because they'll actually come up with an exhibition on it, and there's some of that in our Data as Culture showcase today. I think we're just about wrapping up. To answer Giovanni's question quickly, have you experienced it at absolute scale? I would say at this point in time, no. To be completely honest, I think we are getting to the point where we're seeing lots of people wanting to apply it, wanting to apply more in-depth ethical processes. They are already, but applying more in-depth data ethics processes in projects, and we're starting to see that emerge across organizations as kind of frameworks, but we haven't yet seen it in terms of the 30 to 40 active projects.
Okay. Yeah, I think we haven't the ODI specifically hasn't been involved in conversations where someone says, here's X number of projects and here's how we're applying data ethics and here's how we maintain a consistent approach across all of those. Is one of the things that we're exploring through that work, looking at kind of benchmarking for organizations, looking at what good looks like for organizations when it comes to ethical data practices. Part of that will be embedded in the way that we test the tool and the model that come out of that. But equally, I think we do work with organizations who likely do have that problem. I think a good example is Barclays, who we recently worked with, who I'd imagine have lots and lots of projects going on. And ethics is something that they're now looking as being a core behind a lot of the projects that they work on, and they want to use the data ethics canvas, or are using the data ethics canvas as a consistent way to approach thinking about ethical considerations within projects. So there's information on our website about how Barclays do that and about how other organizations that we've worked with who use the data ethics canvas as well.
And hopefully that also addresses Sai's question somewhat. I think we have to wrap the session up there. Thank you, everyone. Ran over a couple of minutes. But I hope it's been useful to you today. If you've got any other conversations you want to get in touch, then all the contact links are also in the platform, but you can get in touch with us through info@theodi.org if you want more questions on the canvas. But thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Great. Thank you, everyone.